Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today for starters, to be among such amazing minds in the industry, and I'm grateful to not only be among you, but to also have your ear as well. So my name is Shat. I'm a Gen AI-focused game developer at Saltwater Games. We are an established mid-scale studio with a pedigree for VR games like Doctor Who and Peaky Blinders. And actually, we're coming out with an XR puzzle game later called Infinite Insight. We use mostly Unity and Unreal, and now we've started to use Gen AI in all stages of the development pipeline, and that's where I come in. So I've been doing AI solutions for our games, and I've learned a lot in my time about how AI can truly level up a game in ways beyond the standard chatbot, which is great, but there's also so much more that AI can do that expand the possibilities of game development, and it can help our game match our ambitions, and I think it can raise the ambitions as well. And yeah, it can do things that are simply not possible without AI. So to be honest, if you told me 3 years ago, I would be here preaching for AI like I'm ChatGPT's spokeswoman or something, I wouldn't have believed you. Actually, when I first started working with this technology in a professional capacity, I was pretty skeptical. So when I first started working with it, it was in an XR game called Alone Together, where it was an NPC character that you could speak to by taking turns reading off of a pre-written script. And originally, the idea is you'd read your lines, and those lines would help guide the story. Until one day, my boss said, let's just have the AI drive the experience. I thought this could never work, because how would the character know to talk about certain topics in the story? How would she know to talk about the burnt chicken nuggets or forgiving her estranged daughter? And these were important parts of the story. But actually, the AI was able to guide the experience, and it did end up being able to do that, to not only power the NPC's responses, but to guide the story and get us to the key points of the story. So I would expect and hope that there's people here today that are skeptical about AI. Hopefully there is. It's certainly a controversial technology, and it's not without its flaws, and I do hope to address that as well today. So I am curious to know your thoughts. So I've set up a little poll where you can share your thoughts with the room. So if you can actually scan the QR code and just enter a few thoughts about what you think about AI, and we can open those. The password is develop. The QR code will be here shortly. And it's semi-anonymous. I recommend you use a first name. It'll make it a bit more fun. So you should be seeing the thoughts. Okay. Fair. I'll just give it a couple of more responses. A few more come in, I think, our internet. Nice. Okay, pretty positive, pretty positive. Okay. So actually, I have a bit of a surprise. So I'm using AI. I'm going to let the AI analyze our responses today. And this is to demonstrate the power of the AI. So now we're just going to wait for the AI to speak about the results that we've received. Okay. Can everyone see, or shall I read what it's saying? I'll read it. Okay, so it says, hello, everyone. I'm the AI assistant here today. Based on your feedback, it seems that the overall sentiment towards me is cautiously optimistic. Many of you find AI exciting and see potential, with words like intriguing, world-changing, and super power coming up. However, there's also notes of concern with mentions of being legally dubious, scary, and problematic. Looking at individuals, Dave H. appears to be the most positive, simply stating, love it. So, on the more skeptical end, Andre Horshun summed it up as badly. I appreciate you all sharing your honest thoughts. As an AI, I'm still learning and aim to be helpful while addressing valid worries about my development responsibility. I'll leave you in the capable hands of Shahd now. She's the real start here when she remembers where she put her notes. So AI's words, not mine. Okay, so now that we've let the AI speak for itself, and I don't know about you guys, but in case it takes over, I want to be on its good side. So I thought we'd let it have its say. So let's get into the talk. I do hope that served as a reminder of how when you include AI in the little things, it can be evocative of some emotion, as opposed to the standard way in which you could do things. And it can be functional as well. So it did analyze the sentiment of the room, and it did tell me and tell us how you're all feeling, as opposed to me having to manually analyze the sentiment. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the talk. The example that I showed you was done using an LLM, and that's the main type of model that I'm gonna focus on today. So there's different types of AI models, in case anyone doesn't know, but I will be focusing on LLMs. So we have voice cloning models. A voice cloning model is particularly useful in games if you have a certain character or an actor that you need your NPC, if you'll do one, to sound exactly like it. So in our case, we had a found phone game called Missing, where you're using the main character's phone, and you could see like videos of the actors speaking, and later you get to call them. Was powered by AI. So obviously, if we have a voice that doesn't match the actor's voice, it can be a bit disjoint. So that's where voice cloning would come in. We also have text-to-image models. These are quite famous, like DALL-E. We have AI composers, like Beethoven AI, and we have LLMs, which is what I will get into. So I want to focus on LLMs today because I think they're quite multi-purpose. And I will touch on how the concepts that I touch on will apply to all the other types of AI models aside from just LLMs. So what is an LLM? An LLM stands for a large language model, and in a nutshell, an LLM is essentially a completion model. So essentially, it's gonna come up with the most probable completion of a string of characters, almost like those traveling story or chain story games that we play, where you give it a starting string of text, and it will come up with the most probable next completion. So actually, that's how all the famous ones that we know have started. So ChatGPT, for example, back in the day, he was actually named Da Vinci before it was ChatGPT. So back then, in order to get a back and forth conversational-like structure, you would have to prime it to start with as a conversation, and then it would do that. So I have an example of this to further explain. So you can see here, this is how it would start. So you'd prime it by first saying the following is a conversation. You'd give it some initial context, and then give it an example of what you want the conversation to be. And it's going to then complete it with the most logical flow, and then it's going to actually complete till the end. And we would use a stop sequence, and we trim it at that point, and then append the next user query. So yeah, it doesn't know it's talking to you. It thinks that it's just completing the text. So how we got to where we are now is we fine-tuned the completion models in all kinds of different formats to get the human assistant format that is popular today. Okay, so on to AI in games. And here comes one of my favorite usages of LLM in games, and one of the things that it does the best, which is handle natural language. It can handle virtually endless inputs, and specifically, it can handle any input that the user can give it. That's what the LLMs are made to do. Coding, on the other hand, is not intended to do that. Coding is not meant to be an infinite amount of if statements that are made to handle every single possible thing that could happen. And developers, our job is not to anticipate every single possible user input and handle that case. So thus, in my opinion, I think there is a symbiosis here between the LLM and the game engine that we can take advantage of to help us elevate various facets of our games. So I like to think of it with this analogy. If you think of traditional coding as a discrete signal and the LLM as a continuous signal, in coding, just like a discrete signal, we handle specific predefined inputs and responses. And it's precise, but it's limited to the exact cases that we've coded for. So like you can see in the graph, if the x-axis is the case that we've handled, and the y-axis is the response, the block of the if statement, if you will. So say you have an if statement that is, if the user wins the game, this happens, or if the user loses the game, this happens. If the user does anything between those two discrete cases, there's nothing to handle that. Whereas the LLM, on the other hand, similar to a continuous signal, can manage a fluid range of user inputs, and it can adapt to any unexpected queries or commands. So yeah, coding can handle predefined ones, but the LLM can interpret virtually anything. So I think if we mix the two together with some creativity and a bit of smoke and mirrors, we can give the illusion of unlimited flexibility and understanding. And it can seem, if we want it to, that the game can accomplish or handle more cases than it actually can. So yeah, and yeah, I don't think that razzle-dazzle and that creativity is what the AI is meant to do. That's actually on us. So I think we can feel confident that we have a place here, and the AI won't take over that part just yet. So I've put together a meme to help illustrate this point a little bit, and I'll give an example very soon. So in our games, we may want to cater to every single user input and give back a unique outcome for each input, but we just can't code for infinite number of possibilities. The LLM, though, it can understand any input, and it can respond to it uniquely. So the LLM can also do something else, which is it can map that unique input to the closest possible thing that the game can do. This may not make sense, but I have a video to illustrate. So I'll just play this video, and actually I'm gonna play the audio separately because I had a bit of a technical issue. So, okay.
Hi, I am your drone, here to assist you in your day of resurgence. You can chat to me by using voice activation or pressing tab. You can also change my personality and appearance by asking to customize.
Hey, drone, can you sound like William Shakespeare?
Forsooth, good sir or madam, I shall endeavour to speak in the manner of Master William Shakespeare, the most excellent wordsmith and playwright. Pray, tell me if thou art finished with mine customization.
Can you speak French?
Mais oui, bien sûr 00 FBR. Je peux parler frano 00 E7T avec un bel accent frano 00 E7T. Faites-moi savoir quand vous avez fini de me personnaliser.
Hey, drone, take on the persona of a London gangster.
Righto, Governor. I'll be your dodgy bloke from the East End, apples and pears. We having a knees up, or are we done air?
Give yourself a London accent.
Righto, Governor. I've got myself a proper London accent now, apples and pears. Let me know if you want me to change anything else, or if you're done customizing me.
Give yourself a tartan skin.
Righto. I've updated me skin to have a bright tartan pattern. Let me know if you want me to change anything else, or if you're done customizing me.
Okay. So that's an example of what I mean. So in this game, we had a use case of a drone that you could customize. Without AI, customizing this drone in terms of its voice and all the character and all the things that you saw could look like a drop-down menu, or if we really want to make it feel a bit more interactive, it could be a text input. But in order to have these things happen, we'd have to, in the code, match word for word or have some mechanism to parse the string. So yeah, as you can see, you can basically ask it anything that you want it to do and it'll do it. And how did we do this? That's where the razzle-dazzle comes in, the illusion. there's actually a finite set of voices and a finite set of accents that it can choose from, and a finite set of skins as well. But the LLM, it takes your natural language request, and then it maps that to the closest possible matching thing that exists in the game. And that is that use case that I was talking about, the illusion of almost complete player agency that the LLM is very good at doing. Okay, so, and that's not the only use case. Again, that mapping use case isn't the only one, and nor is it a unique one. There's some more, and I'm not going to touch on all of them because of time. But yeah, the first one, you can have locomotion, for example. You can have the LLM map the user's request, its natural language request, to move to coordinates in your game. So the user can say, go forward, or can you go a bit like in that direction, and specify the direction, and it will actually map it to that, as opposed to voice commands that are binary and set. The second thing is you can have the LLM customize your character's appearance. So you can map the user's natural language request of a customization that you usually wouldn't be able to accommodate in the code to the closest matching combination that could accomplish from the things that you've programmed, like I showed. Finally, we have branching narrative. And in this example, in those branching narrative games where you can just select from a set of preset options to help you like navigate in the game, you could have the user actually type their own choice in that's not listed, and that would still also have control with the LLM mapping what the user said. So here's some more ones. There's replayability. These are the advantages of using LLMs as well. So having generative AI in games in general does add to replayability, because each time that you play, you do get a different experience because of the generative nature of the AI generating unique content each time. And depending on how you use it, you can have the LLM control the game flow and thus have different endings, game events, or outcomes, as opposed to simply just different textual content from the generative LLM. And again, aside from the typical NPC personalization, you can use sentiment analysis to customize your NPC. So I will touch on this in a dedicated slide later, but you can, instead of just using the LLM to drive dialogue in your NPC, you can use it to drive the facial animations, to have dynamic facial animations, or really anything that creativity can take you to. So these are now just some of the use cases that I feel like deserve their own slides. So the first one is accessibility and inclusivity. LLMs can be used for accessibility and inclusivity. So like we said, aside from using them as like alternative game controls, that is one use in which you can customize them, and that will be more accessible to people with different accessibility needs. But aside from that, it can also provide instructions on how to play the game, and that can make it more accessible to people that wouldn't know how to do that. And aside from that, in my personal opinion, this is something I've actually experienced, which is I think the AI can help diversify the target audience for a game. So from my experience, I've never really been the main demographic for an MMO game. I much prefer narrative and interactive storytelling games. But like the drone that you saw, one time I asked it to customize itself to speak in a more funny way, and that actually made it more interesting to me. I asked it to speak in a way where it understood pop culture, and when it did that, it made the typical MMO game feel a little bit more approachable for me. So I would imagine that there's many more people out there that may feel intimidated by a certain genre of game, whereas when you add the generative AI in there to cater to their specific niche, it could make it a little bit approachable. So in that way, I think we would be widening the demographic for a game. Because again, the AI, it can do what coders can't and we shouldn't do, which is generate content based on very specific, almost infinite niches. Okay, so one of my favorite use cases for LLMs that I think people often overlook is the fact that LLMs are excellent at performing sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis, it just means analyzing the sentiment in text. So it can understand the meaning or intent behind a statement. So yeah, again, they're good for things other than simply talking back to you. And this sentiment analysis is very powerful, I think, because it can be used to get to know the player based on either the actions that they take in the game or the inputs that they give or simply the text that they speak. And this is done in a way that we can't do in coding. So there are various actions that a player can take in the game. And again, if we compute if statements for every action that a player takes, every choice that they make, it's not practical. So this is where an LLM could shine. So you could send a log of the user's actions and send it to the LLM, and the LLM could then come to a conclusion about the user's personality or who they are. And if you incorporate that in a game and make the player feel that they're understood, that could be quite magical, I think. So an example that I've done before using sentiment analysis is, this was powering an NPC, but again, the usage here is sentiment analysis. When the user speaks to the character, I would take their statement and the LLM would analyze the sentiment behind that. So if the sentiment was analyzed something positive, the NPC would smile. If it was analyzed as something negative, the NPC would frown, and so on. And it doesn't have to be animations, it can be anything. The sky is the limit as to how you use sentiment analysis in your games and what you can let it drive in the game. Okay, so similar to sentiment analysis, another thing that LLMs do very well is classification. And I think that classification has a lot of applications in our games. And classification, again, just to recap, is basically classifying something from a broad category to smaller ones. So you can have a dog breed classifier where you have pictures of a dog and the AI will say this is a German Shepherd or a Golden Retriever. So yeah, you take something from a broad category and the AI sorts it into smaller categories. So classification is relevant for game controls. So for example, you can take a user's command and you can classify that into whatever category you need and act accordingly. So if you ask the LLM to classify what the user says or even does as either being a request, a question, or something conversational, you can then delegate control back to the appropriate parts of your game. And that's how you can set up game control with that as well. So yeah, I'm sure you can get creative to the other uses of classifications in your game. But this is just a reminder again that this is another use of AI aside from simply driving an NPC. And in fact, classification was one of the very first uses of LLMs when they came out. Okay, so I think it's important to address a pitfall here, and that's basically having too much AI in your game. I want to illustrate this pitfall by an analogy, and that analogy is smaller portions of food at rest. So the first one is very obvious of why can we sometimes have smaller portions at restaurants, and that's cost. Less ingredients means more profit, and AI is also not cheap, unfortunately, currently. So the less prompts you have, the more profit you can make, or the less or more money you can save. And the second thing is, unlike in a traditional restaurant where you have a big entree and you get full very quickly, and you leave immediately. So maybe you don't get the chance to enjoy your surroundings as much. I don't believe, similarly in AI, that your game should be fully dependent on AI. Surely there's beautiful graphics in the game, there's a brilliant story and engaging gameplay, and if you let the user have unbounded access to AI, I guess you should ask yourself, are you distracting from the other USPs of your game? Are you, as a developer or a game designer or game director, banking on the AI and thus subconsciously placing less emphasis on the elements that we've used for years to make our games a success? In my opinion, a great traditional game won't go out of style, so let's complement it and not drown it. Finally, I'm a big believer that the only reason that that our favorite food is our favorite food is because we may not have had enough of it. I think if we think of our favorite food item that we've ever had, and we have that for even just 3 days in a row, we're probably going to get sick of it and it's not going to be our favorite food item anymore. The same is true for AI. I think if you give the user unbounded access to AI in your games, not only will they get bored of it, but also they're going to notice the flaws in it. And it's not a perfect technology. So we do have to handle the flaws, and also part of that is make sure that we're making sure the user can access them. So yeah. And yeah, when you have just enough of something you really like and not enough to be full, I think it leaves you wanting more. And I'm not saying that by concealing the AI or limiting it, we should be manipulating our players. In fact, I think strategically including the AI in our games is an act of creativity of orchestrating it and hooking the players. I think it's intentional and should be a part of the game design process as opposed to it being deceptive. Okay, so how do we actually put the LLMs in our games and use them? The two popular options for this that are being used are training your own model or prompting a pre-existing proprietary models. And training your own model doesn't mean making an LLM from scratch, because you do need a few £1 million to do that. But it means fine-tuning a pre-existing open source model. And yeah, there's several advantages and disadvantages to each of these strategies, and I'll go over those. So here's a couple of the popular open source models behind me. We have Llama 2 and we have Llama 2 Chat. There's GPT Neo and BERT. I put BERT there because it's actually better for classification and question answering, and it's less good for generative text, so it wouldn't be good for completion as much as the other two are. So yeah, I'm going to try to read from the slides. But Llama 2 Chat, the prompt structure is generative. So it follows the example that I gave where it's not human assistant and chat-based. It's just open-ended and it completes. Llama 2 Chat is similar to ChatGPT, where the prompting structure for that is in the human assistant format. So if you say, you just simply command it and it will give you back a response. GPT Neo and BERT would use a generative prompting structure as well. So the other option is proprietary models. And these are the paid foundational LLMs that we all know and love, like ChatGPT, Anthropic, Claude, and the model from AI21 Labs. These are usually much better at doing what you need them to do than the open source models. So in this case, you can get away with a wide variety of your use cases by simply using few-shot prompts or zero-shot learning. And zero-shot learning means no examples. Few-shot learning means you only need a couple of examples to get it going, as opposed to needing the tons of data that you do to fine-tune a model. And you'd be surprised at how effective they are. I think ChatGPT speaks volumes for that. Today, there are ways to augment these models with more information, because oftentimes they're not fine-tunable, or fine-tuning them is not as straightforward. And if you would like to augment one of these proprietary models with knowledge, I would suggest looking into RAG architectures to do that. So here's a summary of the pros and cons of each to help you know how to use each one. So the open source models are definitely cheaper to use because you don't need to be paying like a subscription for the model provider. You simply have to pay for the cloud infrastructure that you're hosting it on, but there's no need to be paying the owners of the models. Also, when you're fine-tuning a model, there's more transparency. So these models are open source, so the source code is publicly available, the algorithms are there. Whereas when you're prompting it, you can't see any of the source code, you don't know how they did that. Training also, you have more control, and fine-tuning is less straightforward. So open source models, you can definitely fine-tune those. And in the proprietary models, it's not always as straightforward to fine-tune them. So I believe Anthropic Claude wasn't fine-tunable. I think they may recently have done that, but usually the proprietary models are not fine-tunable. Also, similarly, in the same vein, you don't need to be dependent on the model provider. So if you want to use ChatGPT, you don't have to be paying a subscription to OpenAI. You're free to not have a relationship with any model provider or any third-party service. Also, in fine-tuning models, there's a longer development process. So getting the data, curating the data, that's a lot of work, and it needs specialized team members and data scientists. Whereas when you're using the proprietary models, you don't need all of that right out of the box. You can just prompt your model. And similarly, the open source models are not very reusable. So say you have a NPC again in your game, and you're using an open source model to fine tune that NPC. That's only really good for that character, but when you need to do another one, again, usually you're going to have to redo and recollect all the data specifically for that one. Whereas when you're prompting a proprietary model, you can just redo it again, and you don't need, there's no data that's lost, you just reprompt. And yeah, similarly, you need more technical knowledge for the open source models to fine tune them, because you would need someone that knows about like models and fine tuning. Whereas in the prompting, there is a little bit of an easier learning curve. You don't need as specialized knowledge, but definitely people would need to have technical knowledge. Okay, so I have some strategies and optimizations to cut down cost. So I think something that I think is a good strategy is to use the proprietary models to generate the data and keep that data. And this doesn't mean when your game is in production, you should definitely not be keeping the data of players without their informed consent. What I mean is during development, you can keep internal prompts. So for us, for example, when we were developing that drone, we were obviously in development talking to it, and that's generating the prompts, and we're paying for those prompts anyway. So with everyone's informed consent, we can collect these prompts, and then you can use that as training data to fine-tune your open source model. That way you can almost have that same thing, but for cheaper, because you've done it on the open source one. Another one that may seem obvious, but you should train or / prompt your model specifically for each one. So a good ChatGPT prompt, for example, is not necessarily the best prompt for Anthropic Claude. Similarly, when you're getting your data for an open source model like Llama, for example, the structure of that data and the process of training it is not necessarily going to be the same way you would do it if you're going to fine-tune BERT, for example. Honestly, it seems a bit obvious, but reading the documentation for each of these providers specifically goes a really long way. When I was developing with this, when I was first doing prompting Claude in the way that I used to prompt GPT at the time, it wasn't acting the way I wanted it to. But when I opened the documentation, I actually did it the way that they advised, it made a huge difference. So I have an interesting also best practice, I think, which is putting the blinders on your players and using the power of suggestion. This one has kind of a niche use case, but I thought I'd mention it because I think it's important. So say you're using the AI to drive some kind of narrative in your game, or you're using it, or you're using it to perform something out of a set of functionalities, and you don't want the user to, there's something that you don't want the user to access. And it would break the illusion if they did. So the strategy is, by using the other elements of our game, we can try to make sure that the user doesn't even think of this. So for example, the drone that I showed, the drone actually is not able to sing, for example. So if the user asks the drone to sing, that would fully break the illusion because it can't do that. So one strategy for this is we need to use the power of suggestion and make sure that we're instructing the players in a certain way that doesn't even suggest what's not possible to them. I hope that does make sense. Secondly, we can mix and match cheap versus expensive models where you can. So if you have an NPC, for example, that's a quote-unquote crazy character, you don't necessarily need a super expensive LLM to drive that character. You can substitute for an open source model to drive that character. That way it's not as fatal if something goes wrong with that, and you can play it off as part of it. Whereas if you want to use AI to power game control where it would break it if it fails, then in that case you can use the better and more expensive model. And on the cost side, you can use server-side rate limits. So it goes without saying that you need to have some rate limits when it comes to financing the game. And this is especially the case if you're using a proprietary model. So most of these models are priced by the token, which is proportional to the player's usage. So it's a great idea to have on the server side some way to limit that. Or maybe even the most simple one would be to shut off access once you reach the prompt limit. But you can also do something different. You can use a more temporal approach like throttling, where you could limit the rate at which the players access the AI. And if not, you could also set up a serverless endpoint that sits ahead of the model invocation, and that can do all the logic of limiting the usage. And remember, there's also ways aside from just like not allowing more calls to the AI. You can optimize it on the server side as well, so on the game engine side. You can try to shorten the prompts when you can to make sure that the cost doesn't pile up. And also something to note is doing the math for the price is also really important. So not everything is priced the same way. A prompt where you do sentiment analysis or classification would be calculated per the whole block of text, whereas if you're doing chat, it accumulates. So every time I say something back to the AI, that actually token gets saved, and the chat history is also saved. So each time it's not as straightforward as the price is just the text. It accumulates. So I actually did the math for that, and I do have a calculator specifically for chat-based interactions. If anyone's interested, I can share after. But I do suggest using, doing the math, setting up your own calculator, and making sure that you know how much it costs. The other one is to use a RAG-like architecture to fine-tune a proprietary model. So in case you have a use case where you need industry knowledge or specified knowledge and you're using a proprietary model, you can use a RAG-like architecture. And a RAG architecture basically means you get an embedding model with your knowledge base, or any document that has your industry knowledge. And that model will map, it will get you the relevant chunks of data, and it will send those to the prompt. That way you're not using the whole block of knowledge. Okay, so ethics. It's no secret or doubt that AI usage can be extremely unethical. AI as a technology has done serious tangible harm. It has done from wrongful arrests to the murder of innocent people. And even though the ethical consequences for AI in games are not as life or death as how it's being used in other industries, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering ethics, and it doesn't mean that there's not ethical guidelines that we should follow to make sure that we're not really hurting anyone with our games. So I have some best practices, in my opinion, for using AI in your games. So luckily, when we're using foundational models or even the open source models, they already have some form of filtration to cancel out harmful content. That doesn't make it foolproof though, so it's best to research with that specific provider the measures that they've taken and fill in any blanks. So the first thing we can use is content filters, and a content filter is basically another AI call that takes the output of the AI, and it will rank it on a scale of 1 to some numeric scale that ranks how likely is it to be offensive, and that way you're able to cut off based on what you can personally accept in your game. Another thing that we can do is to use another AI model to act as the content filter. That way, if your main model missed something, the other provider is likely to catch it. So in that way, you're actually prompting your own content filter, but mix and matching the models. So for example, if you're using a text-to-image model and you want to make sure that it's not harmful content, from DALL-E, for example, you can have an image classifier that takes the generated image and then ranks that as whether or not it's likely to be harmful, and it's from another provider. Another one is don't let or try to minimize how much the AI drives the high stakes aspect of the game. So if there's an element in your game that's quite high stakes, so say you have an AI NPC that's based on a real person and you don't want it to get something wrong, maybe look into RAG, or even just make sure that that's not being driven by the AI, maybe just hard code that. Also, when in doubt, be transparent. I think that's really important. Even when not in doubt, be transparent anyway. It's always a good idea to include disclaimers and just be transparent and say that this technology is not perfect. It can make mistakes, and handle that accordingly. I think the honesty in and of itself will build good rapport with our players. And like I said, to use a knowledge-based RAG, if you have knowledge where you can't afford to get things wrong, like maybe driving something based on medical, mental health, that type of thing, you would not want to rely on the generative AI. You would want to have some form of knowledge base or a RAG that has proper knowledge. Okay, so in summary, I think LLMs are a tool to add to our creative arsenal. I think our creativity is unbounded, and if it were up to us, maybe one day in the future, games can evolve into an extension of our imagination and subconscious. Traditional coding has only gotten us so far, which is amazing, but we can also do so much when we add Gen AI. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm happy to answer. Okay, lovely.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I was just curious, what was the one time where it was responsible for someone's bodily harm, or you mentioned like an edge case where it was responsible for something?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh yeah, when you were talking about the dangers of it, you mentioned that in games it has like less authorship, but you did mention some edge case where it might have in other industries been responsible for someone's death.
Oh yes. So basically, yeah, currently there's the gospel and Lavender AI systems that are being used by governments to detect like airstrikes. That's actually currently being used now by the Israeli government. So that's how that has led to the death of people, because it has a 10% error rate. So yeah, thank you for the question.
I guess slightly following on from that, how do you manage the stigma of using AI, especially if you're sort of releasing products into a sort of a marketplace where maybe people don't have an intricate knowledge, they've just sort of heard about how it's going to take jobs away from people, artists, etc. How do you sort of manage expectations in that mass market and weigh up the risk of the advantages this brings to your product versus potential publicity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think currently AI is always going to have that stigma right now, and there's not much I think that we can do, but let the technology speak for itself, I would say.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. Something when it comes to development with AI and LLMs is how do you account for for QA and testing these things robustly enough so that things where they can't be abused by the end user by getting them to do something we don't want them to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely, that's something we've been trying to do in the studio as well. So currently, what we've been doing, like for the drone, for example, when it comes to testing, we would, the drone can actually take like certain actions. So when you like prompt it and say, for example, change your skin, if it does that, then it did succeed. But when it comes to testing for more generative content, it is definitely less straightforward. But depending on how you're using it, like in the case of sentiment analysis, for example, sometimes there is a binary way in which you can test it. So I would, for example, test and say something mean to the AI. And if it frowns, which is my intended action that I want to have, then that would be a success. But yes, definitely when it comes to more generative content, for example, if you're using it to drive an NPC, it's not as straightforward to gauge because it's quite subjective whether or not that interaction with an NPC was a success. I'm not aware of like any formal ways in which we could test that, but yeah, definitely something to look into. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think time's up. Thank you guys so much.